If it's a mystery, I don't want to give it away. But I don't think it's a mystery. So it's they're both sunflowers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This could be.
Kind of a big difference.
I mean, big difference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll take them.
Sure.
Oh, did you see that?
Did you see? Okay. I want to get this too dirty. So we can sort of see. Okay, so I want to honor all of our time for coming, showing up on time, and for anyone else that may come, we can thank you, Joe. And what else? I actually, this is nice that it's a small group, and so I hope discussion and questions can guide us, and I have a trajectory we can follow if we feel like resting into that, or we can go in where areas people want have more questions, we can sort of choose our own adventure. So, and first I'd just like to start with the flyer and setting an intention and some gratitude just to start. So the context for me is patriarchy, and that for me, this is my definition. With patriarchy, needs are met at the expense of others, and I want to live in a world where needs are met at the benefit of others. So what that might look like as an example would be, calling someone a name or making a judgment against someone might provide a little bit of connection between you and another person, but ultimately that comes at the detriment of the whole. So to me it's a survivalistic or a not well thought out strategy of how to meet needs. And there can be ways of meeting needs, and I hope as we get through this and our discussion will illuminate that there can be ways to meet needs, whether it's in the soil or community or for yourself, that come at the benefit of the whole, that increase the foundation for the whole to be able to meet your needs even better in the future. So they can be compounding, as opposed to the patriarchy right now, which is extracting, and often, it comes, there's a villain, and yeah, we'll get more into that. I'm thankful, and that being said, I live in patriarchy, so a lot of my needs as a cis white male are met at the expense of others. And people defer a lot of privilege to me, whether I know it or not, and I can just live my life like, wow, this life is really easy to live. Why is it hard for you? And not have to question why that's so. So I'm thankful for the gifts I've been given, even if they've come under a system that I don't believe in. I'm thankful for my family. I'm thankful to be on this Wampanoag land, and I'm thankful for you guys showing up, and I'm just kind of reading into the future, but listening and contributing if you want to. I can see it in your eyes. It's already happening, so I appreciate that. And I hope to steward the process and not the end result. So I have some ways of being with this material that that may or may not produce a goal. So, and I would just like to take 30 seconds right now just to sort of, this is important to me, and just let this set in. So I'm just going to take 30 seconds. Thank you. Okay.
Can we ask questions
Yes,
as we go?
yes, please.
Can you go back one slide?
Yes, please.
I was curious about what the dry down of
Oh, great,
patriarchy is.
great.
I like the term, but I don't know what it means.
Okay, so there's an agricultural term. It's an agricultural term, dry down, and it actually, to me, it should be called dry up, but it's called dry down because to me, it goes. Plants desiccate from the bottom up when they're going to seed.
Yeah.
And so.
Oh, okay, so
So-
it's going to seed.
Yeah, so we're going to look at this a little bit later in the slide, but this is how I see plant growth, and it goes from, seed to the radical coming out to the seed inverting itself, and then the little sprout, and first stages of growth, and there's a lot of, we'll look at this a little more, but to get to the point where I'm saying we are here as a society is in this dry down where the plant, all of its resources are going up into the seed, and we're at a point right now that I'll show a little bit more later how these resources are being extracted from the plant and the soil, and it's a kind of volatile situation for the life of the plant to be going to seed. It's like it's dying, the plant, if it's an annual plant, it's dying. And even in a perennial plant, there's a element of this fall decay going to seed. So I guess, yeah, it's to me highlighting that choice for me is really important in this time of divisive talk, just seeing a lot of what hasn't been seen in our country, whether it's the Me Too movement, immigrants, and how this, not saying this is something, I'm not saying it's natural, but I'm just saying how this metaphor for what a plant goes through might be helpful to find choice for ourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of faith right now, but maybe it'll become clear. Real quickly, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Luke Prima. I love Erin Cove, so that's why that's over here. I was at town meeting and captured in the newspaper, so I participate a little bit. This is my family. I grew up in a family with 7 siblings, and they like to visit Provincetown. My parents had a house out here in the 90s, and let's see, I guess it's important how I got into soil. I've always loved being outside in nature, and a lot of my jobs were almost all of my jobs were landscaping. So I did landscaping in Western Mass, installing gardens for second homeowners, and then rooftop gardening in New York City, and I helped start a nursery in Brooklyn, and those are all like 5-year chunks. And then my health, I was diagnosed with bipolar 12 years ago, and when I was 20, so it's 18 years ago. So there was a long stretch of time I was on medication, and my health was like flatlining, and nothing in my life was really shifting, and I was getting just 10 years of just, it felt really stagnant, and I could see other people's lives. They were, in steady relationships, they were working towards a future of a family or a career, and none of this was accessible to me. I was just sort of treading water, and never really realized it. And after 10 years of being on medication, I started to question it a little bit, like, what is this diagnosis? What is this medication I'm on? And it was really easy for me to start to question it through the lens of soil and plants, because that's something I understood really well. And when I went to a talk about looking at regenerative practices in soil and agriculture and plants, it made so much sense, and I could take that and put that onto the body and be like, why isn't that allowed for me? And I was able to play with that. And I've been off medication about 6 or 7 years now, and my life began again when I got off medication. There's a lot of, I started to study for the first time in a way that was life-centered and really just absorbing. Like I couldn't go to enough farming conferences. I worked for NOFA Mass. I put on their conference, their winter conference. I found 65 speakers for them, and I just absorbed, just couldn't, went all over with it, and also stayed at home and started a little farm, a little 3-acre farm that was wildly successful and wildly financially unsuccessful, and but it was so much fun for me to just explore with a lot of these principles and make mistakes, and it wasn't my main source of income, so I could I had read at A Way to Feed Chickens. I'm just blowing up the top right now, but a way to feed chickens is you can take roadkill and put it in a 5-gallon bucket and poke holes in the bottom and put that over a tree, hang it up in a tree, and then the maggots will decompose that roadkill and the chickens will eat the maggots. And so these are all sorts of things that I would love to experiment with. Or I fermented my clothes because I had learned that fermentation increases the rate of reactions in a system, and that if clothes aren't organic and made natural, they have a lot of residual chemicals in them. And so I was like, why not ferment my clothes? No, it wasn't. But my wife at the time didn't like the smell of my clothing.
I was going to ask how your relationships went after that.
Not the best. I was, and this is a little more serious, but at one point, and we'll get to it if we get to it, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, ehrlichiosis, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. I loved walking in the woods. I would come back covered in ticks every day, and just, and I knew about Lyme disease, and when I was a kid in North Carolina in the 80s, I got Lyme disease, which was unheard of back then. And my dad was a psychiatrist, so he went going to medical school, and he heard of this thing, Lyme disease, so they put me on antibiotics. And then at this time in my life, I was starting to question antibiotics, and I didn't do antibiotics. And that was, as far as my relationship goes, that was kind of a breaking point for the relationship I was in, because that was too much for that person to hold. And I'll talk more about that. And enough about me. I think more of that will emerge. I want to know, who are we, or who are you? So if we could just go around the room, say a name, and maybe if you want to, anything that why you're here or what you're interested in.
Okay, I'm Linda Fiorella. I have a plot at the community garden, and so when I saw this, I just was really interested in finding out more about what you could share based on your experience, because I read a lot of, you have had a lot of experience, so I was just really curious. So I guess I'm here out of curiosity.
Awesome. Thank you for coming.
Geneviève Martin. I love nature. I love the outdoor. I'm not a gardener. I do very little, but I love the plants. I love the trees. And I like to be exposed to new things to think about and maybe to do.
Thank you.
My name's Laura Ludwig, and I love to get my hands in the dirt, and I'm always trying to think of ways to not have to buy anything for my dirt. I like to find things that help it. So, and I think you're an interesting person, so I wanted to hear your talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Who wants to go next?
I'm Tim February. I'm the 10th liaison of the community garden, and I love your passion and commitment to this, and I believe a lot to teach. So,
Thank you.
I go by Wave, and I do mostly artwork and some social environmental justice things in town and out of town. And I haven't done much gardening, but I love being outdoors so much. I was in Camp
about how to make my garden better. I had my first garden ever this summer, and it was pretty successful.
Yeah.
I mean, it really was. And I know I could improve a lot, and I just want to keep learning how to make a beautiful garden.
So, thank you.
My name's Luann. I'm a nurturer, and we have a garden. And I just thought it would be interesting to hear Luke's take on gardening because I just love Luke. Ever since I met Luke, going on 3 years ago, we were in a mask making thing for the Day of the Dead. I went, who is this guy? I have to know who he is. And for a short period of time, he was gone. And then he was back, and I was so excited he was back in Provincetown. So that's
Thank you.
My name's Jim. I'm Luann's husband, actually. I do a little bit of gardening along with Luann. Interested in nature in general. I'm part of the Provincetown Conservation Trust. I've been recently, by the way, sticking signs in the ground all around town, if anybody's seen them.
What are they?
They indicate all the land that the Conservation Trust owns. As opposed to a lot of the conservation land is owned by the town, but we have restrictions on it. But we also own some land ourselves,
The trust us.
the trust us. And so I was marking all of those because the town does a nice job of keeping the other ones all marked and tells you about them and stuff, but our land wasn't, people donate it and stuff, so there's some recognition for it. Plus, it's interesting to see where it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. With that.
Oh, by the way, also, as an advertisement, we're on, what is it, October 19th? We're having, yes, at the Red Inn, at 2:30, we're having a party, the Conservation Trust. There's free drinks and food. It's just a couple of hours long, but everybody's invited. We have some important things to talk about, so I'm glad you'd like to join. Please do.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, and this is where I'm from. I'm from Western Mass, Great Barrington, and I'm also from North Truro. I manage a hotel in North Truro. Okay, so with every slide I'm about to present, we could spend a long time, and I might go a little fast. I might go a little fast. So, and please ask questions. So, so how a plant changes through its life cycle has been important for me to pay attention to, and this is something I've been playing around with, is the growth pathway and the reproduction pathway. And so at some point you can see in most plants' life cycle is that they go from this vegetative growth to the energy starts to head skyward, and a lot of these leaves actually act as the nutrition for this process going skyward, and which ultimately ends up in seeds for animal plants. And what is also interesting is the Nature Institute in Ghent, New York. I've taken some classes there, and Goethe believed that there was no distinction in this process, that you could actually see leaf throughout this whole process. And what that means is he could see in the flower petal the leaf, which is not that hard to do. You can kind of see how it is it's a changed version. It has qualities of the nature of the plant in the flower. So if it's a rose petal, it might have this same sort of rounded leaf shape as the rose leaf and the rose petal. There's a relationship there, so you can sort of see it. And Goethe and people who followed him could even follow that process into the reproductive organs of the plant. So the stamen and the pistil, they could see how they were modified versions of the leaf. Like really get into this, seeing this as a process and never losing sight of the character of the plant. You know, like this archetypical leaf. So an artist, this would be really much easier for an artist than a scientist. It's like someone who can not have to relate all these changes to an equation or something like that. Just let this be a process they breathe in. And why is this important to me? Well, that, and I hope this becomes more clear with this pathway, the reproductive pathway, I'm gonna kind of claim right now, and maybe you'll start to pick up on this as you grow plants for yourself. It is hotter, showier, bold, more focused. I'm gonna claim it's foundation consuming, and I'll get into how that is. There's an element of the full moon that has this sort of yang energy. And then this growth pathway is more the cool, the raw, awkward, the foundation generating for the plant. So in the springtime, the cooler temperatures, you'll see a lot of plants bulk up with their form. And then as the hotter temperatures arise, you'll see plants and changes in light. There's many layers you could look into for how these changes happen from growth to reproduction. And growing weed is now legal in Massachusetts, and a lot of weed growers know this, that they have certain fertilizers they use for building fertilizers and light requirements for having the plant build its growth and then going into reproduction. So just I'm going to jump around a lot, and we're going to leave things maybe incomplete, but they might all connect as we go along. So I hear a lot of times that our economy is a growth economy, and to me, I don't believe it as a growth economy. It looks more like a flowering or an extraction economy. This in the reproductive pathway, and why is that? It's because I'm going to say that this pathway is more like having our needs met at other people's expense. So this plant right here is building this foundation. It's pumping. I'm hopefully going to show this a little later. It's pumping all these sugars into the soil and setting up this foundation for which it can then draw back from. And but you're going to have to take a little faith for right now. Okay, so I passed around those jars of soil, which most people got a chance. Oops, I called them soil. I didn't. So shout it out if you feel like it. Like, what is soil? What's soil made of? Where does it come from?
Decomposed metals?
Yeah,
Like
totally.
organic matter?
Totally. Anything else? What are some qualities of soil? I heard someone say you smelled it. There's a quality. Earthy.
Yeah,
Moist. Yep. There's a moisture component to soil, definitely.
Textural.
Yeah, totally. And that texture. So one of those jars is clay, dried clay,
That's why I didn't recognize
and I brought the wet clay, or I had the wet clay, and then I was like, people are going to touch this, and they're like, I need napkins and everything, so I just swapped it out for the dry clay. And the other one is sand from the Beach Street Garden, and the dark one is soil from my garden plot. So, and that's
This is sand or clay?
clay. That's clay.
And this is soil from your garden?
Yeah, that's my
He's
garden.
doing something right.
And the sand is the base. So that's just below. That's what most of our outer cape is made up of. And the distinction between clay and sand doesn't look too big from the eye, but from like a surface area point of view, clay is ridiculously small and flat and is able to hold moisture differently than sand. Like if I poured the same amount of moisture in the clay and the sand would dry much quicker than the clay. And so, so what,
You talk about fermentation.
Yeah.
What's that?
so why,
The
yeah.
soil is fermenting.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So, so what is a plant's relationship with the soil? What is going on there? What's the connection? Food,
Wow.
It's nurturing.
water, nurturing, yeah. Stability, yeah, totally. I like that. So here, let's see. So where do we want to go? So we'll start here. So a healthy plant will have at least as much root biomass below the ground as their plant biomass above the ground. So it's equal proportions. So and a plant can leave 50% of its total photosynthetic carbon in the soil. So that just means of all the carbon that it builds itself out of. If you were to weigh this without the water, because plant is mostly water, and it was like a pound of carbon, that would mean that the plant would also exude out of the roots a pound of carbon. So how is soil made? That kind of leads us to how is soil made. So you said decomposition. So one way soil is made is by plants. Plants are pouring out carbon through their roots. And part of that, I think, is like a refrigerator, like they're filling up the fridge. And with that, with pumping out, say if this was a sugar maple, there might be some sugary sweetness down there. There's going to be some sugary sweetness down there because it has a relationship with the plant. It has sugar mapleness coming out of its roots. And so the microbes down there feed off of it. And the plant can then choose what it wants from those interactions. So I bring up why, what's the relationship between fermentation and the soil? So as fermentation, if you have a refrigerator, your apple juice will stay pretty good for a while. But if you leave that apple juice out, it's going to start to ferment. It's going to start to change. And so the plant, my belief is the plant pumps out all these sugars through its roots. And as the soil is cool, and the qualities of the plant, I believe, can also refrigerate it a little bit. Like essential oils have properties that can slow biological reactions down. Like essential oils can act as preservatives or act as, like, thieves oil, they say, can prevent the plague at one point, that it can control reactions. So this plant is pumping out all these sugars, and as summer goes by, this is going to start to ferment, and that fermentation is responsible, in my mind, for the switch from that growth pathway to the reproductive pathway. And so you get access to a lot of different elements in the soil that will help the plant build its fruit and its flowering development. That's a lot to take on faith, but hopefully that will emerge a little bit more. And so other ways of, other relationships with soil, not ways of building soil. So there's tillage, which most of the time people associate with being destructive to soil. And I would say a lot of the tillage that's done in the United States is destructive to soil. So this is, if this plant is building a relationship with mycelium for mushrooms and microbes that have different stratification based on temperature, and we come in and we turn this all up, that that ruins a lot of this balance that the plant spent effort in getting almost access to free energy. And so, and also tillage exposes a lot of the soil to air, which starts oxidizing a lot of the elements. Like if you left your food out on the counter, it would start to spoil and not have that raw, vital quality to it. Other relationships with soil, cover crops. You can grow plants to help build soil, and then some people will turn those plants into the soil, so you actually feed the soil those plants that you grew on the soil. And there's mob grazing. These are more wide open practices where cattle will be confined to small areas in a field and moved over time to replicate like how the buffalo used to graze the plains. And so the even dispersal of their manure, the long rest period that the ground has to come back to life, allows for this like pulsing of the ground that is able to build soil. That's claimed how the soil of the plains were built. Compost, you can basically adding soil to build soil. And then charcoal and humates are ways like clay of being able to capture qualities. Like if you want to capture some soil nutrients, you can use charcoal and humates to bind to them, and they'll stay in the soil longer.
What's humates?
Humates, it's a byproduct of the coal industry, and they are carbon that has been in the ground for a long time that I wouldn't suggest that we need humates, but because it's a byproduct of the coal industry, it's available, and that it is carbon that didn't undergo the extreme pressure like coal did, and so it's just above coal in that stratosphere. So when they're digging up for coal, they throw these humates out. These humates have great ability to hold on to nutrients. And so you can sprinkle them into your soil, and one of the reasons we're talking about why nutrients and holding nutrients is so important is because out here we get so much rain, like the rain we just got. You can imagine if you had a fridge that had its door open and tiny little food particles, and the rain was flooding your fridge, it would take your food out, you know? And so plants have to be creative to be able to hold these vital nutrients. And hopefully you'll see that they exist off the same food sources that we do in terms of like our human calcium requirements is very similar to what plants require. And then the last thing is if you measured the microbe count in a human digestive tract, it would be 8 cubic feet of compost. So that says two things to me, that the human digestive tract is loaded with microbes. Because if anyone is familiar with compost is really alive. Like you'll see lots of bugs going in and out. You'll see occasionally the voles down at the bottom working in it, and from a microscopic picture that this compost is really microbial alive. And to have 8 cubic feet squeezed of, like, dirt has quite a bit of surface area, so something magical is happening in the human digestive tract to be able to hold that many microbes in there. And there is a similar relationship with those microbes and how we get food and how plants get food. Okay, so I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit. So this slide, I don't want to get too much into the science behind it, but for almost every element, there is a relationship with plants, and a lot of those relationships are similar to our human relationships. So take calcium and boron, and if you have osteoporosis, or you know someone that has osteoporosis, they'll recommend a supplement that has calcium in it and also boron in it. And sometimes people are not even recommending so much calcium for osteoporosis because they say it causes calcification. So without this synergistic relationship between calcium and where's
Can't
boron?
find it.
It's not on this. It's not on this one, but boron is over here on this one. There is a relationship between calcium and boron, and that a lot of times plant growth can be limited by what these relationships are. And that can seem really far out of view, like I don't want to learn all the science around all these different things, but there's also some simple ways of looking at it that that hopefully will emerge, that will allow you for some choice in this interaction, from this presentation. So one more thing is that this is a pH chart, and a lot of people talk about pH in soil. And one thing I find interesting is that what I was talking about fermentation is an acidic reaction. So if you're familiar with like pickles have like an acidity to them. So that acidity comes from sugars in the cucumber get eaten by the microbes, and the byproduct is lactic acid, which is like a vinegar. So that acts to preserve that pickle, and then we have those pickles. So what happens in the soil is those sugars that are in there can ferment and produce that acid and drop the pH. So in the beginning part of the season, we're hanging out with calcium and molybdenum, which helps nitrogen be absorbed, and a lot of these other elements. And then as it switches over to more of the acidic scale, you'll see a rise in the trace minerals, zinc, manganese, iron, and aluminum, and we'll see why that's important a little bit later. Okay, I know this is a lot of information. I wish I could tie it together a little more succinct, but we're gonna jump around a little bit. So, so the way Roundup works. Roundup is a chelator, and which that means is it comes from claw, like to grab something. And so when I was talking about humates and charcoal, they also hold onto things in clay. But Roundup is a certain kind of chelator that once it grabs elements, it doesn't let them go. And so that sounds kind of innocuous, like then it just binds up things, and that's not that bad. What it does is it binds up, it's a broad spectrum chelator. It was invented in the mining industry, so when these workers were working in heavy metal mines, they would spray Roundup back in the 30s in these mines, and they would grab some of the heavy metals. What they didn't, someone must have realized is, oh, you spray this on a plant, the plant dies. And so why is that plant dying? Well, the Roundup mostly focuses on manganese, and manganese is essential in fertility. This is the side of the reproduction pathway. And so that is what seed formation forms around, is manganese. And so Roundup grabs not only manganese, but it's a broad spectrum chelator, so it'll grab enough of elements that when you spray Roundup on a plant, it chelates, it grabs those minerals from the plant and just nutritionally starves the plant from the outside in. And that plant doesn't die from that starvation, it dies from a soil pathogen that is found throughout all the ground. It's called fusarium. And so fusarium comes up and decomposes the plant and says, this plant is, nature doesn't need this anymore, it's just gotten instantly so sick that fusarium just, like wildfire, just decomposes it. So you've heard of Roundup Ready plants, and what they do is they genetically modify plants so that when they get bit by fusarium, the plant is producing a toxin that is toxic to fusarium. So it still gets all its minerals cannibalized from it by the chelation of the Roundup. And then when fusarium comes to do nature's diligent work to decompose a sick plant, fusarium is hit by this natural toxin to fusarium. So, So you can see from that speaks to two things. One, how Roundup works, and then how genetically modified plants work, which is this thinking in that patriarchal way of, okay, let's just let's solve a problem by creating more problems. Because what that happens is when you feed this Roundup Ready corn to, say, cattle, or humans, you're seeing ridiculous infertility in the population, because all of that manganese that's essential for fertility is being bound up. So the dairy cows can't breed back anymore. They're infertile, and we're basically creating more problems down the line by this us versus them philosophy. And then the reason I believe that Roundup is so dangerous to have in the environment is because when you chelate those elements and it gets locked up in Roundup, and Roundup spills out into the environment as that plant decomposes, that when other plants or animal life access that chelated manganese or chelated group of elements, they believe they're getting in something they can use to build their frame with, but because it's chelated, it can never come out of that locked relationship. So, and then this flip version, how PCBs work, the river that runs through the town I grew up in, the Housatonic River, was GE dumped PCBs from the 30s to 1977. They jumped, I think it was like 7 million pounds of PCBs over that time period. And so PCBs they're chlorinated, and they're these benzene rings, two benzene rings, real similar to atomic weight of essential oils. So they're right on the borderline of being volatile and floating in the air. And the chlorine surrounds these benzene rings, and it's a similar relationship as Roundup, where the chlorine never actually cleaves off, and like chlorine is an essential element for growth in plants, and I think even humans require a tiny bit of chlorine in their diet. But what happens with PCBs is, because of the volatility of this molecule, it creates, this is what I believe, is that those benzene rings with chlorine around the outside act as almost like a megaphone of chlorine. So that one little drop of PCB in your system can influence a whole bunch of reactions. And the thing that has been important for me to hold is that it's about a balance of all of these elements, not just whether you have a certain set amount of copper or not. Like it's how all these play with each other. And so that may become a little more clear as we go on. I'm looking at the clock. So when I would do soil testing for farms, we would look at about 16 different elements, and you can manage, this is a soil test of my B Street garden plot, and then the compost from the town's compost. And what I noticed from there, let's see, so there was a man, Albrecht, who studied soil mineral balances, and he did some amazing science which will never be duplicated, which is he tested what mineral balance in soil allows for plants to grow the best. And so he took like tiny bits of manganese, potassium in rock powders, because different rock powders have different concentrations. So this is calcium carbonate, which is limestone, so that would have a calcium component to it and a carbonate component to it. And he would take all these different mineral rock powders and mix them with soil and come up with millions of different grow trials to see what was the balance that plants performed the best in. And so he came up with this balance: 68% calcium, 12% magnesium, 5% potassium, and then on into the parts per million of other elements. And so it's not about, it is also about how much calcium your soil is able to hold, but the balance was, for him, was really important. And so when I look at a soil test from the garden, one of the first things I look at is this total exchange capacity, and that is how much the soil can hold nutrients in it. And so that is like how dark and rich your soil is, or how much clay it has in it to be able to hold nutrients. So if it's sand, it'll have almost zero exchange capacity, ability to give and receive nutrients. If you have clay, it can have up to like a 30 exchange capacity. My soil had 15, and you want to, like, as a soil test, you want to try to get yours above 10, which is just, you don't need to do a soil test to figure that out. It's just a dark, rich soil will be able to, a lot of times, depending, you can fake it, but using natural practices, you can get that soil exchange capacity up there. So just the takeaway I want from this soil test is that one thing that is low is sulfur. And I had most of my other elements are pretty good. There's some trace minerals which are doing some funny things, like for some reason out here zinc is really high, and I'm not sure why zinc is really high, both in my compost and or my soil and the town compost. It's nice to see a tiny bit of cobalt showing up, which is rare. Manganese, that fertility element is low out here. It's higher in Western Mass. What else? But sulfur, like Western Mass, is also low. It's at a nice level in the compost that doesn't get much leaching, and that's fresh. But sulfur, there's some elements that leach quicker than others, and sulfur is one of them. And so adding then when adding based on a soil test, it's like a tiny amount of these rock powders. So there's different kind of rock powders that are mined across the U.S. and you don't need much at all to balance your soil. This is not something I would suggest just getting into and thinking this is going to be a fun thing to learn. There's a lot of science behind it, but the basic is hopefully I can show that you don't really need to go down the soil test route, and we'll see why, but just if I wanted to balance the sulfur in my soil, I might add something like elemental sulfur or gypsum, which has a sulfur component to it. And for a 10 by 10 plot, you only need 2.5 ounces of these, of those little sulfur pellets that you see people put around their hydrangeas or their blueberry plants, which is tiny, tiny amount for a 10 by 10 plot. It's like, like this little quarter cup sprinkled around. So it's these tiny amounts that can have a really big influence, and that nature, from the work of Albrecht, can require a really delicate balance for this overall performance to emerge from the soil. And each one of these elements has a different relationship. Like potassium is involved in fruiting, calcium is the structure of the plant. Copper is involved, I think it's involved, it has a conductivity relationship, just like copper wiring. And like I said, boron, some people know if they're glass blowers, they know like boron is an element in glass blowing that helps with the strength of that silica. It just like parts per million, it adds this, almost like a catalyst for that strength. Okay, so now we're going to get a little farther out of convention. So, like I said, when I had that little farm, I practiced with making fertilizers and making soil, and this is my garden plot here at the B Street Garden. And last year when we had that fish kill of all those little fish, I collected a bunch of those little fish, and then when I was growing a cover crop, I think it might have been I let arugula go really big. Like I did a whole patch of arugula. What I did was just cut down the arugula, sprinkle these little fish on, turn it into the soil, and in a week, those little fish were gone. They just decompose, the bugs, everything, eat them, and parts of those little fish will hang out in the soil. And another thing, what I did in Western Mass was to try to save some of this. Fish out in Western Mass was more rare, but there was a fishmonger out there who would give me his fish scraps, and this is a picture of an axe and fish scraps all over the yard, and I would chop it up with an axe and then get organic bulk sugar from the co-op, and you'd layer the sugar and these fish scraps, and sugar acts as like a draw to pull out the fish oils and the fish proteins, and it like releases all those nutrients into solution, and then you can use that as a fish fertilizer. And the one thing I like about that's better than fish fertilizers you can buy in the store is those fish fertilizers you buy in the store are stabilized with strong bases or strong acids, and so that denatures the proteins a little bit more, and so they're like, it's almost like cooking. Like if you were to put your hand in lye, you know, that's almost like you're burning your hand, and basically that's how they stabilize. They drop the pH super low or raise it super high to stabilize that. With sugar, it's a little more, it's still more floral, you know, like even if that could be. And then over here is, I played around with making, the local butcher would throw out all these bones, and I took a 55-gallon drum and filled it up with beef bones and pig scrap bones, and I also threw some wood in there to make charcoal, and then I would make charcoal out of it, so you would seal the drum, put it over a fire, and just leave it for a long time, and then this would all turn into bone char and charcoal. And so bones, it's a lot of the same qualities of the fertilizers that you want to put in your garden do the same thing for the plants. So bones is like structure, and phosphorus helps to build roots and structure for the plants. So they're really similar. But so a lot of, so I've been, there's a picture of a sink here because at my house I like if I don't know how to get into this. I should have put the other slide first. So I eat like weird food. Well, I'll just put that out there, that's a judgment. I eat raw eggs and raw meat and green juices, so a lot of raw food. And so instead of washing it down the sink, I have plants out front that I'll like rinse out my egg shake or smoothie and just water the plants with it. Because I'm seeing that a lot of these qualities that come from food are directly connected to how the plant grows. So if you look at some of these high-end weed grower magazines, you'll see that they'll say, okay, our new product has microbes, enzyme, amino acid, minerals, carbon fulvic charcoal chelate binder. And I look at that, that's everything that raw food has in it. Raw food has microbes, enzymes. Enzymes are the tools that microbes use to break down and for reactions to happen. The amino acids are the proteins, you know, that's what's in there. Minerals, minerals is built into, you know, the body, but we also talked a little bit that those can be added too, and then the carbon charcoal is a way to hold on to that. So instead of paying someone, you know, $50 for this little drum of a gallon of fertilizer, I've been just rerouting my sink to water my plants, and learning that if this is a path that you find choice in, that that learning how much plants actually need is something you're going to become aware of. Because my first impulse is like, if some is good, more is better. And then I quickly learned that plants need far less than my human stomach needs. Just so you know, like 8 cubic feet fit into here. Like plants don't need that much at all. And then I put this little Terra Prima. That's Prima's my last name, and Terra Preta. It's a play on Terra Preta, which is an Amazonian soil that people discovered in the Amazon that this Amazon has red clay infertile soil. Even though there's a rainforest built on top of it, there's no rich, humusy, dark soil in the Amazon naturally. So as soon as something hits the ground, it decomposes and walks away and changes form. You know, like a leaf hits the ground, bugs eat it, other bugs eat those bugs, it turns into a butterfly, flies away, the butterfly decomposes, like it starts again. So it's just all in cycle. But then they found these spots in the Amazon where it's feet of rich soil, and it's human-made deposits of these, humans made these deposits. And one of the components that a lot of people put stock in, which I don't believe in a one component thing, but they noticed these bits of charcoal in the soil, and so they saw that this high rainfall environment that leaches a lot of nutrients was impeded and slowed down by having that charcoal in there, and I definitely agree with that. But I also think there was much more of they were much more living in relationship with nature, that they knew. They started to dissolve a lot of these boundaries of like, okay, this is good to put in the soil and this is not good to put in the soil. So they saw a lot of benefits in, like, they didn't see waste basically, and that's what I'm having this question. Okay, so a lot of times when I tell people I eat raw food, they're like, oh my God, what about food poisoning? And yeah, and so that so. My view on that is this is just what I believe, and I don't want you to go home and play with something that's not that is not safe for you. However, that being said, I've eaten raw meat and raw dairy, and well, green juices aren't that big of a deal for, I think it's coming up on 5 years now, and that has been part of my healing from getting off of medication. And so one reason that I believe raw food is important is because if we were looking at that pathway of the growth pathway and the reproductive pathway, the cooked food is actually more in that reproductive, go energy, stimulated yang pathway. Like, that's where cravings come from. Raw food is much more cooling and grounding, and it's not that glamorous. I mean, I've started to have a taste for it, but around the full moon, I'll still be like, I need a sandwich. You know what I mean? But that's like craving I'm drawn for. But this raw food for me is really grounding. And and so the question about food poisoning always comes up. And to me, that is, one of the major ways people get sick from, or get food poisoning is from a cooked substrate. So say like a hamburger that's been cooked touches a raw hamburger, and then that hamburger that's been cooked gets left out and is allowed to ferment. Now the only thing that's going to ferment on that cooked substrate the proteins have been denatured and cauterized and the fat has been bubbled and the structure's all broken down, are the most virulent pathogens, your salmonella, your E. coli, because those are the ones that pioneer harsh terrain. Those are the ones that, on raw food, they're there. They're just waiting to see if they need a job to do. And so it's kind of similar to like if you had, you could probably find seeds for lamb's quarter in the forest, but why isn't it growing? You know, it's like the seeds will blow in there, but the forest is not the place where lamb's quarter, a little weed of the meadow, turned up soil, grows. Like only those weeds only grow in places that the soil gets turned up and disturbed. You're not going to see them in an old growth forest. And so to me, raw food has that kind of relationship where you can take raw milk and you can put it in a jar and leave it at room temperature and leave it out almost indefinitely. Like I've done it for a really long time, and it just separates, it turns into farmer's cheese and whey. And both of those are delicious, and they never turn into, like if you had pasteurized milk and you left that out, the pasteurized milk, as good as it tries, as hard as it tries, it still doesn't get all the microbes that have a relationship with milk, whether it's you open the jar and some come in through the air. Over time, that pasteurized milk will swell up, and when you open the top and you smell it, it smells like vomit. Like that, those are the microbes of harsh terrain that are producing these byproducts that cause sickness because it's harsh terrain. So another way to look at it is if you're familiar with like the deadly amanita mushroom, that the death cap.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And if you look at where that grows, a lot of times it grows in harsh terrain. It grows in places where the soil's not very good, it's sandy, or it's underneath pine trees, which are kind of like first pioneer species. So what I'm trying to say is to question the food poisoning around raw food, the vilification of raw, because it's more a question of the context from which that raw food came from. Sure, if like in the 1930s when there was botulism coming from milk because they were feeding the cows distiller's grain, like if you have a super sick animal from being fed spent distiller's grain, you're gonna have milk that has potential to get you sick, even if it's raw, because that animal is basically inflamed from the inside out. It's being like, it is undergoing that yang cooked sickness pathway, and so you're drinking, milk that has a high, not to be too gross, but it could be like pus. It's a product of that sickness. But and of course, if something is poisonous, you can get sick from it. If you ate the deadly amanita, even if it's raw, you're gonna get sick from it. So I'm not saying raw is like God and go out and eat raw food, but I'm saying maybe start to question what is pathogenicity and how does it relate, and that'll become a little more clear with soil.
What's keto?
Oh, keto and fasting. So playing with the raw food. You've heard some people talk about a ketogenic diet now as
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
so ketogenic diet is like bears in this time of year are like eating everything. They're eating the berries. They're going in all the garbages, or coyotes too. You'll start to see in their poop rose hips. They're eating, so they're eating all the carbs. And when you load up on carbs, the extra carbohydrates get stored as palmitic acid. Anything you can't process right away gets stored as palmitic acid, which is saturated fat. So you bulk up from eating carbs. And so through the late summer, all these animals are doing it. And then as the temperature drops, all those carbs disappear, and they rely on the fat stores. They go ketogenic, and that is almost through a fasting. But if you're like a predator, you can eat some rabbits here and there, or if you're a rabbit, maybe you can nibble a little bark here and there. But you're heading towards it's not like a turning a light switch on. You're heading towards the keto pathway, so you're digesting using fat as fuel as opposed to glucose as fuel. And so glucose is like that yang patriarchy side. You get a spike out of it, and then a crash. A lot of people get a crash, later after eating. Whereas that ketogenic pathway is more in the raw, cool, awkward pathway. It actually happens in the cool times of year. It's a slow burn, and they say fat is 5 times more efficient than carbohydrates as a fuel source. And so also that people say ketogenic diet is a great diet for cancer prevention, because cancer feeds off of sugars. So if you're doing that, and so this diet, when you look at it, it's it has a lot of that keto quality. Like I eat a lot of raw butter from an Amish farm in Pennsylvania. Raw meat doesn't have much of a glycemic index to it, and either does raw eggs. I do like raw honey, but raw honey is like a little more less Maybe I'm just telling myself that. Okay.
Raw fish too.
Raw fish, yeah, yeah, and so raw food is not so far out there like steak tartare or like sushi or even in southern Japan there's a raw chicken dish, and I've done it all. I've done raw pork, raw chicken, raw everything, and there's we'll get into more how the terrain determines the expression. That's what I believe. Okay, so are there bad guys? Okay, so if I'm saying there's no, like if eating raw meat you don't get salmonella and E. coli, because they are ubiquitous everywhere. It's like the fusarium. It doesn't come up and just. It's not like a great white shark that can get you at any time. The conditions have to be for that fusarium to want to decompose. The same with E. coli. The same with I'm going to say with bugs. And so there's been these studies of insects that this is a Brix meter like they use in the wine industry to tell sugar levels. And once Brix gets above 12, the sugar percentage in the plant, and not manufactured sugar, not if you genetically modify a plant to produce sugar, or you're testing sugar cane, but the leaf of a plant, that the plant then stops being susceptible to insects, because insects can't burp, is basically what it is. So when the sugar level gets too high, if they were to eat this, it would ferment inside them and they would explode. And so that holds true for your crop plants. Like there's a performance place that your crop plants could get to that would be disease-free. So this is a weed that was growing in the lettuce patch in my garden, and the amaranth was loaded, this is amaranth, was loaded with these aphids while the lettuce was free of bugs. And so what can happen is you can get the soil to be able to meet the needs. Our vegetables have more needs than the wild plants. Like they've been bred to have, these bigger fruits or bigger stem or delicate sugary leaves like lettuce, but the wild plants don't have those needs. So you can get it to a place where you can get the soil's needs to be so met that the wild plants don't find home in that soil anymore, and it's actually hard for them to live there, as exemplified by that they get the bugs and the vegetable plants don't. And so one really interesting thing that Philip Callahan discovered, and a lot of these discoveries go off the radar a little bit because it goes so much against the face of conventional science, is he discovered that, this is me holding up a antenna, and so the way antennas work is they capture waves, and the spacing between here determines the size of the wave that they're going to be able to fit in there and the information that you're going to receive. And this is also a brilliant array right here, and people have wondered what they're tuned into. And Philip Callahan said they're tuned into infrared. And infrared would basically be inflammation. So these bugs that come and attack your plant can see where there's inflammation, where the needs aren't being met. And so they come and they see the inflammation and they start the decomposition process. And then we say, bugs, what the fuck are you doing? We're trying to grow a crop here. But really, those bugs are a messenger that crop could be healthier than it is. And so this picture right here is a picture of essential oils. And so Phil Callahan said that not only do insects see inflammation, but there's a relationship with essential oils, and that essential oils can act, that are emitted from a plant, can act to sort of broadcast that relationship with heat, because essential oils are volatile and they float in the air. So if you have a plant that is inflamed, it's going to be releasing this cloud of essential oils. Subtle, super subtle, but if these guys all their life have tuned into this art of looking at heat as their way of looking at the world, they're going to be able to see these like plumes coming off of a cornfield from miles away of like the heat rising. Whereas if you have a cool plant in that yin pathway, needs are being met, foundation building, they're not going to come decompose it. What else? Okay, so we'll get to invasives, I think, pretty soon. Okay, yeah. So what does this mean for invasives? So I'm going to claim that there's a context for pioneering plants, and if that context is met, you're going to get invasives. So there's conditions in the soil, or and then maybe not just soil, because we're playing with climate change and air pollution, temperature changes, that context. Right now I'm focusing a lot on soil, but that context could be changing temperatures, that there's a context that supports invasive species. And not only that, I'm going to claim that invasive species are not only messengers, but they're active to a certain extent. They can be active correctors of that imbalance. And that's a little more of a stretch, the active correctors. The messengers, I think I could convince a lot of people to get on board with that through this, but we'll see that. And this little funnel right here is just to show that I believe there is a balance that plants are kind of getting to. What these metrics are, whether it's soil metrics or temperature, I'm not really hashing out, but I'm just saying that plants' virility or how pathogen things are increases the further you get away from this balance that life is heading towards. And I'll get to that a little bit more. So this was a garden I worked on. It was a bocce court that a second homeowner in southern Connecticut, or no, northern Connecticut, just over the line by Connecticut. I grew up by Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. And he had a bocce court. He didn't play bocce. He said, I want a garden. And so I said, dig out all this stuff and get your local, get a local contractor to fill it up with soil. We'll test it and we'll see where we're at. I came back 3 weeks later and Japanese knotweed was growing all in it. And it was sprouting everywhere, and he didn't even know what Japanese knotweed was. And so I was like, do you know what this weed is? And he was like, no. And so I was like, that's good. I was like, we're not gonna dig it out. We're not gonna do any of that. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take a soil test. We're gonna see what the cation exchange capacity is, the different minerals. We're gonna add compost. We're gonna add minerals. And we're going to keep it mulched, and every week when I come to plant new plants or do a tiny bit of weeding and straightening up, I will fertilize with a liquid fertilizer, which was like a fish fertilizer, that the slide I showed you, mixed with all sorts of other stuff. And so we just grew right into the Japanese knotweed, and the Japanese knotweed would get occasionally like this big, but it was stunted and it had smaller leaves. It wasn't like if you go to Beach Street Garden, we have some of the tallest Japanese knotweed around. It is like a fully outstretched hand. I can't reach up to it. I got a leaf today, and it was that big. And so, like this I showed you before, these were both growing at Beach Street Garden. This one was growing where we're doing the trials for planting our wild plants. And this one was growing in my garden. And so you can see the context can determine the expression. And with these pioneering plants, their form can change based on that. So this is garlic mustard right here, and this was garlic mustard from a spot. So in Western Mass, I would take care of second homeowners' ornamental gardens too. And I would get them on board to do mineralizing, adding these rock minerals based on a soil test. So if you need a little bit of calcium to get this all balanced, that outside of that area that I treated was healthy, tall, robust garlic mustard. Inside that area, the leaves start to not be fully expressed anymore. And it almost looks like that last slide I showed you of the lance quarter. And then over here, in my greenhouse, I took goutweed, and I was so confident that this greenhouse had the best soil, because one benefit of a greenhouse is it doesn't rain, so it doesn't leach the minerals out. And so I took goutweed and I planted it in there, and it didn't do anything. It just sort of put on a couple leaves, and then the tomato plants grew way over it, and it got crowded out. And by the end of the season, I forgot where I'd even planted it. And goutweed is like this weed that people are like, if you get it in your garden, you'll have it forever. And it's true that I think it might hang out in seed form or little rhizome form, but it'll only come back if I did something to dramatically change the conditions here. And that goutweed then will spread like wildfire. And part of saying that they're active correctors is if, to go back to that one of those beginning slides I had, if a plant is producing, if 50% of its total carbon is left into the soil, over time, these places where these invasive plants are living is places where carbon is being built into the soil. And that is something that I think, conservation should start to do some more tests on, is what is the relationship between context and expression. And then, maybe even question that these invasive plants might be correcting an imbalance, and how much of our human actions are actually creating drag on the system. This is supposed to say heroin rat study, but one thing that I really liked is I heard this study that rats were put in a cage and given a choice. It was either heroin or cocaine water and regular water, and they just over time killed themselves from drinking the heroin and cocaine water. And that was proof that heroin or cocaine is addictive, and once you start, you can't stop. And then this other guy saw that study and said, well, wait a second, what if we made a rat paradise, and we had all different ages of rats, and we had grass and water flowing and sunlight and big cage and space, and we put the same two waters in, and they don't use the heroin and the cocaine water.
So the context.
Yeah, context has a huge relationship there. So there's some books that question the invasive plant paradigm. They're fun to read, and they stretch, and they're not, still to me, they don't offer enough in terms of context. One thing I like to say is invasive plant medicine from these plants, because they are high performing plants. If you recently I was hanging out with some Japanese knotweed and noticed how many bees this late in the year are working it over. It's like the whole plant is humming. And so that, to me, there's a quality to these plants that is really vibrant. Though my belief is that they're, like Chinese medicine has this distinction between medicine and tonifying. And so medicine is something you're on for a short amount of time to meet the energy of the sickness, to like harmonize like fire cider. That's medicine. But tonifying herbs are ones you can take every day. So your reishi, your chaga, these things that are like in that growth yin pathway, like a green juice you can take every day. But invasive plants as medicine, I would clarify as to make that distinction that it's medicine, not something you want every day. It's for sickness. And so, to me, I'm not saying I think invasive plants are good. I would love to live in an old growth forest where there weren't any invasive plants. Like if you took these invasive plants and when there was giant sloths and megafauna, and you put them in the land, they wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't be able to, those trees were epic back then. Or 1491, when there was 300-foot tall chestnut trees and understory 100-foot tall sugar maples, and you're able to drive a carriage through the forest. If you threw invasive plants in there, they wouldn't do anything. They don't have any, they would maybe be like these spindly little weeds. There's no niche for them to be in, and niche kind of implies that's like a Darwinian way of thinking, like survival of the fittest, which I question. It's not a niche. It's more like how can I help the community? That's what each plant is asking. And so one example of this is I was working with this farm, and they're growing everything beautiful using this high-end Vermont compost, which I hope hope we'll get a chance to talk about. And they're using the Vermont compost potting soil to do these sprouts, and they were selling the greens, those little packets of lettuce sprouts. And there were with arugula, they couldn't grow them. They were like, yeah, look at like the lettuce grows awesome, the mesclun grows awesome, but the arugula, it won't grow. And I was like, have you tried other seed? They're like, yeah, we tried other seed. And I was like, oh, that's weird. You know, you have like the best potting soil in the world. You've tried different seeds. What could be going on? And I thought more about that relationship where the more wild of a plant you are, when a balance does become really broad and able to meet your needs, your job isn't needed anymore. And so arugula accumulates, it has that sulfur, you know? And so I asked them about their water, and they're like, oh yeah, our water does have high sulfur levels in it. And so I think there was a combination between the potting soil having really good sulfur levels and the water they used that had really good sulfur levels, that the arugula was just like, I don't have a job to do anymore, you know? And it's from more of like a community view than a survival of the fittest view. Like arugula is actually bringing sulfur in, which sulfur is needed 10-to-1 relationship with nitrogen to build proteins. So you need sulfur to build proteins. So if you're an animal living on land, it would be great if sulfur did its job, or in this case, wild grapes, and they are, you know, building sulfur levels through this forest. So I've started to question what for conservation, because I have an element of conservation, I have an element of agriculture. Like, what would the need in conservation be? And it's like, for me, it's a need for connection with nature, because a lot of times agriculture has been divorced from nature, and I'm wondering, you know, how could there be a no walls mothering relationship with nature, and how to raise all boats with a beautifully ridiculous broad definition of nature. And yeah, I'll get into that a little bit more. So, like I said, the Housatonic River near me is polluted with PCBs, and they're talking about dredging and creating these dumps along the river of PCB mud and capping them in plastic, and it's like, this is a nightmare. If you learn about some of the, like, zebra mussels are in our area, and they're vilified big time, but if you learn about some of the qualities of zebra mussels, their filtration, tiny little mussels, like, I've looked at them underwater, they're so small, and they cover, like, if you put a tree branch in the water, they just cover the whole thing. And they filter like, something like 7 gallons of water, each one, a day, and that water is filtering through, like, the equivalent of a mini version of our gut, you know? It's like water goes into this moist environment, and microbial reaction is happening inside that mollusk, and that has a greater chance of breaking down those PCBs. Like, PCBs do break down with nature. It takes an epic long time for, I don't really know what the pathway is, but if it's similar to, well, we'll talk about what that could be in a little bit. Mindful of time, so just, and so one way to look at invasive plants is they might be the plants that have been the furthest from the conversation. So they grew up in really rough places, like Japanese knotweed comes from an island north of Japan, volcanic island, cold conditions, you know, just gnarly minerals, heavy metals, like rough. It comes from this gnarly place, and then it comes here, and it's kind of sad that it finds home here because of how much humans have disturbed the environment. You know, like, you'll see Japanese knotweed a lot of times growing by car garages. Almost every car garage or gas station has Japanese knotweed. Or boatyard. And there's a heavy metal component to a lot of the oils that those places use, you know.
Does it process some of that?
Oh yeah, and that, I mean, that's how nature breaks down stuff, is the more biological reactions, the more things are gonna break down, you know. And that's what plants, by pouring all that carbon down into the soil, creating home for reactions to happen, that's care in my mind. That's like a caring component. Okay, this is kind of the fun part. So that's a picture of me when I was really sick. I didn't use antibiotics, but that was strep throat, not Lyme, which was, well, I think it was worse. So I got diagnosed with Lyme ehrlichiosis, anaplasmosis, babesiosis, and I was like, you know, I'm in really good health. I believe that my body will be able I'll be able to respond to this. You know, it's like if Trump got elected in my system, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna show up. I'm gonna learn what I have to do. I'm gonna show up. Some people, I wouldn't suggest doing this for anyone, you know, but what I did was, so just randomly, my wife had asked for me to save my urine to pour around the garden because she read that deer don't attack a garden if there's urine around it. So a few days before I got really sick, I had saved my urine, and I noticed in the bottom of it was this much sediment. There's so much stuff. So before the real epic reaction started, those spirochetes were, if it was the Lyme that was mostly doing it, was breaking down all this collagen that was poorly built, being like decomposed, like the fusarium, being like, this is crap. You know, you built this the wrong way. You used to eat Twinkies and you were on antibiotics all your life and you took medication. Like, this is all payback time. You know, going in there, cleaning it all out, and putting it into system. But there's a point where the detox pathway, like blood can only change by a tiny percentage of sugar in it before shit gets haywire. Yeah, like you can really, so like this getting into the system is not, like the body is such a fine balance that can cause a lot. And for 3 days, I would have 12 hours a day, like a seizure on a couch. Just like totally incapacitated. And that third day, I was just like, if this goes on any longer, I'm gonna lose it. And that's when it shifted, which was also happened with strep throat, but strep throat took a month. And that was, I think, partially because I had gotten strep throat so many times as a kid. My parents loved antibiotics, loved giving me antibiotics. But some of the things I did was, I saw that and I was like, well, charcoal I know binds stuff, so I was taking tons of this finely ground charcoal. I was taking the invasive plant herbs that Stephen Harold Buhner recommends, fire cider. I was doing this thing called high meat, which is like really far out there. Epsom salt hot baths, and then just a lot of rest, breath, and awareness, and just letting the disease take its course, you know, and just, you know, really just nurturing myself. Yeah. So we're gonna skip that. But this is a lot of like what's on the patriarchy side and how it might be a process. How we might, I don't think it's essential, but how, like I was reading that in tragedies, a lot of times people can come together like they've never come together before. And so on this patriarchy side, how can we not ask for that event, but respond to that event in ways that that come back to that our needs being met at the benefit of others. And one thing I really want to just point out is Max. This is Max Dashu did some research into. She went to Harvard in the late '60s. Or maybe it was early 60s, and she just was like, this is a male institution, everything they're studying in terms of history is about domination, and like, I don't want to, like, this doesn't make any sense to me, like, there's got to be other cultures that we're studying, that had a different relationship with their community, and sure enough, she found in this artwork of super antiquity, 30,000-year-old range, so many similarities across cultures that were vastly separated across the globe, where women held like huge, important roles in that culture. So it wasn't the opposite of patriarchy. It was more of a life-centered society, a matrilineal, a mother right society that really worshipped life. So women as healers, women as trance dancers, women as hunters. Gender art that would show gender like from our perspective ambiguous relationships to gender as having huge roles in that, And this is from sub-Saharan Africa to Eastern Europe to Japan and China, that she would find these pieces of artwork and line them all up. So that is really inspiring to me, because the period that she lines out is human history is 100,000 years old. And she's seeing this in the art as old as 40,000 years. It's probably older. And so if you look at this, this patriarchy place we're in, it's just a very small blip on on how humans related to the world. And so, and how humans related to the world for such a long time was that foundation building, I believe, that foundation building pathway, where if they're living in such relationship with nature, that they're acting to compound all this, let plants build this beautiful carbon in the soil, worship fertility, like their gods were, they had, a lot of them had these, Venus, like that Venus goddess, like the fertile mother. And so they're worshiping all these practices and land relationships that were bringing up all boats at the same time. So what we're living off of now is that foundation that these people created. So that's
Well, we don't call it Father Earth, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so in terms of that community, we have a lot of resources here already. And we could go in deep into all those. And then as far as visions go, I want to be really mindful of time. I'm going a little bit over. But I see a lot in a restorative justice approach to what we've been doing. And so Indigenous, Black, Brown, poor, and women needs being met first. Workers union, like out here on the Cape, there's a big distinction of who works in which parts of jobs on the Cape. There's a lot of my Jamaican friends are in the kitchen or they're cleaning motel rooms. And I think that doesn't mean that it comes at the price of all of our freedom. It lifts us all up together. So affordable housing, we all know this. Tourism, I'd love to see a tourism cooperative out here where all the hotels bought in together, and that we were able to take our money back from big like Expedia and Booking, which are taking 15% off all our hotel revenue. And then we could use that money to say, we want to use natural cleaners, we want a people, planet, profit model as opposed to just a profit model. And there's so much stuff that we share, and there could still be place for individual flavor. And then community-owned projects, like we're talking about getting fiber optics or more land. I love some of these models of a free stuff library, a free fridge, free peer support. Okay, so there's some of the more fun, like I would love to see a food forest under the Pilgrim Monument in that space that's not being used.
Cool.
And so it would have to be a convergent facilitation agreement, which means is like, I don't want to just start something that a few people are going to care about and it's going to fizzle away. If the whole community doesn't have buy-in, I'm not doing it. And at the same time, I love the idea of commons and places that people, could plug into. I really question, would it be an elitist project because property value is so high here? Would it really be used by the people? But I think it would be really fun, and it would be, a way to, like, the town has a glut of compost. You could create a help gym, because I go to the gym now, I'm like, why am I going to the gym? Like, why can't I do something that, like, actually, allows the needs of others to, like, to do something that meets my need for working out and physicalness that actually lifts all the other needs, you know what I mean? So we could have help gym, and it could be really, we could be building these terraces and filtering this soil down, and that could be our workout, and just let it happen over time, Or another thing would be forest artists, and I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Underground Tom. Have heard of him in Nantucket? No. He builds these structures secretly in the woods and just lives in them, and he's. But the reason I'm thinking about it is because I've heard that some people have said that forest fire is a potential in these pine forests with all the down branches. And if you had, forest artists who were embodying, like, who had let go of, like, they don't need soap anymore. You know, they don't need any, they just need some clothes and whatever. And they had a relationship with building charcoal out of the down wood and living in tune with nature, kind of like a mobile version of the dune shacks. You know, like they had, you know, basically like the Wright brothers getting back into a land relationship. You know, like it's kind of a far out there idea, like indigeneity. Like how do we reapproach?
But that's a whole other slideshow.
That is a whole other slideshow. Yeah. Okay. And then, but just to think about it, like a community compost farm. Carl Hammer in Vermont takes the food waste from Mount Pelier, and he has 600. But when I talked to him, he had 2,000 chickens. So I did some math on 2,000 chickens. 2,000 chickens fed for free on this food scrap landscaper waste compost pile would produce 40,000 dozen eggs a year. And those are basically organic eggs. And so that means if there's like 3,000 people, we'd each get like, 15 free dozen eggs a year, which is not much, but it's kind of cool. And not everyone would want them, and you could use a lot of that waste spread out to have a community farm. I'll go a little faster. Water is really important. I get bummed when I see the water tower has like has chlorine in it, and then it has the cell phones on it. It's just like, oh man, we're really hurting our water. And then, maybe there can be no wild other. And by that I mean maybe our gifts can we can figure out ways that our gifts can flow into nature to enhance nature. Like out here, I saw these on, where was it? By Pilgrim Spring, hazelnuts are growing. And wild mushrooms are in the dunes right now. This is chicken in the woods, blueberries, of course, rose hips. This is like rose hip honey, or rose flower honey, or like pine pollen goes for like $50 a pound. Or no, more than $50 a pound, but it's, you can harvest that in the dunes. And so I take some of this stuff from the dunes, but how do I give back? And if we have a glut of compost, or if we had a way of having these forest artists flowing through and bring like the mob grazing equivalent, like how do we give back to these natural lands around us? And that's it. So just have an ending quote from Mary Oliver: you don't have to be good, you don't have to walk on your knees for hundreds of miles to the desert repenting, you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. That's just a snippet of that Wild Geese poem. And so I just asked at the end, can you imagine a world where needs are met at the ever-increasing in benefit to others? Yeah. Thank you for being around for so long. Sorry, I went over.
So Luke,
Yes.
talking about composting,
Yeah.
do you put fish in your compost?
In my compost?
Yeah, because like we compost all our vegetable matter,
Yeah.
and but I never put fish in.
I would put.
Okay.
If we're talking about at my house,
Yeah.
I would.
He would eat it, actually. He would eat it.
Yeah. Yeah. I would put it in.
We put
Yeah.
fish in our compost.
Yeah.
But we bury it because it does attract, moths.
Yeah.
Fish or cold fish?
Any kind of fish, like believers, like the carcass.
Yeah.
The heads and the
Yeah.
breasts.
It's like every time, that I make fish,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's great.